We're going to look a little bit more in depth at the different forms your arguments can take. You're about to start drafting and crafting the researched argument that you'll give to me, where you're taking a position, you've established some context, you've looked at counter arguments, and you've got a whole pile of research you need to start using in order to help build the case you're going to make to me in your researched argument. This PowerPoint is written like some of the others that we've used this semester by our composition director, Dr. Kenneth Gillum. I want to lead you through it just to give you some examples, and as we go through, I want you to pay attention to the ways you might use some of these techniques in your paper, even though most of you are going to follow one of the three that we're going to look at here. And at the very beginning, we're going to break all of the different kinds of arguing and presenting cases to audiences into three groups: classical argument, Rogerian argument, and then choir preaching. That last one, if you've ever heard somebody say you're preaching to the choir, then you've probably got some sense of where we're going with that third kind of arguing. But the first two may seem a little bit less familiar. That first one, though, classical argument, is what you are probably writing right now. It is what you normally see in academic writing. It's definitely the model that we use in our court system today. Essentially, the assumption is, or the official assumption is, you've got a neutral audience, truly persuadable. You're going to give them evidence, and then they're going to make a rational choice based on that evidence about what the only rational decision is, or what the most rational decision or conclusion is. When we talk about subjective and objective arguments, when we talk about arguments, counter arguments, this is what we mean. We do tend to act as if evidence can point only in one way. We've talked quite a bit in this class about how that actually is a rhetorical construction. You want to make it seem like there's only one conclusion, and that's the one that you've come to. And essentially, to be an ethical and honest researcher and a rhetorician, you do have to kind of divide your mind into the honest research phase where you've got to draw a conclusion, and then not dishonest, but persuasive rhetorical phase where you try to do everything in your power to convince your readers, your audience, that you have the best answer. So in order to do that, while we are using evidence and we are in theory presuming a neutral audience, you do need to take into account what you think your biases and your readers, your audience's biases are, and then think about the best order in which to present information to them, the best language to use as you're presenting it to them. But still, primarily, you want to rely on logic. You want to rely on taking into account all of the arguments for and against your case and treating them with respect and due diligence. This is sort of the outline of what a classical argument should look like, and it's the outline of what your papers will likely look like. If you think about the court case, you've got opening statements, prosecution makes the case and presents evidence. The defense makes a case, presents evidence. The prosecution comes back and says the defense's evidence is not good enough, and here's why. And then both sides make closing statements. Now there, you can see the state does get a chance to speak twice. The defense only gets one chance, and often doesn't get a chance to give a rebuttal or a reevaluation to the prosecution's rebuttal of their evidence. You might argue that that's fair or unfair. At the same time, this is all about debating the merits of the evidence, just like we'll be doing with your argument and with the data that you use, the research you use in making it. You will follow a very similar line if you're using classical argument, as most of you are in academic papers. You give an introduction of the case, the question you're considering. You give the arguments for your position, and in that introduction, when you're laying out the case, you'll state what your position is. Then you give the arguments for it. You give other people's arguments against your case or for solutions other than your solution. Then you explain why they're wrong. And then ultimately you give a conclusion that restates your case and then draws everything to a close. And that's when you might see some emotion coming into your argument as well. Now notice that note at the bottom. In writing, all of these parts need to be there in making a classical argument, but you could vary the order. You can't vary the intro and the conclusion. Those have to come at the beginning and the end. But you might choose to start with counter arguments. and then give a rebuttal, and then make your case. Often, if you're writing about something that people have a lot of familiarity with, that might be a way to go about it, because then you get to state the answers that other people have given and explain why you disagree with the things that other people might assume is the best approach. Or if you're dealing with a question that a lot of people feel like is already solved, that's a good way to get into what they think they know and explain what you find wrong with it. So in deciding how exactly which order to put all of these pieces in, think about how favorable or hostile your audience might be, and also, most importantly, think about how much your audience already knows. But at the same time, notice you've got to have the things that we've talked about before. Context, as you used in Project 2, lay out the whole context of the issue. You've got to deal with the counter-arguments, you've got to treat them as reasonable things, and then explain what's wrong with them, and then you've got to have plenty of evidence to support your case. All right, let's look at the other forms of argument and talk about why you may or may not want to use them. Rogerian arguments, this is the kind of thing that you're going to do when you assume that your audience is hostile, when you assume your audience doesn't agree with you. If you know you're about to make an unpopular case and that your audience is probably not going to change its mind about its ultimate position, essentially you're not making a case on the big questions. You're just asking for little concessions. This is the kind of thing that you're most likely to see in politics, where you've got two parties in this country that are bound and determined not to agree on a lot of things. And they can't necessarily give ground. They disagree with one another, and they're not going to change their position ultimately. And so what do? You negotiate. You try to say, look, we have to work together. When you see the term middle ground, essentially you're looking for commonalities. We disagree in big places. Where can we agree in little places to try to get something done? And the best example I can think of for this is a topic that I'm hoping none of you want to write about, and that is abortion. And let's just, for the sake of this argument and this example, imagine that you are arguing the pro-choice side of the argument. At the same time, you know that you're a pro-choice supporter making an argument to a pro-life crowd. In that case, you often hear people who are pro-choice say, look, what we both have in common is we want to reduce the number of abortions. And the best way I think that we can do that is this. The best way you think we can do that is something else. But since we want both the same end thing, fewer abortions, we should take the following measures. And in that case, you're probably not going to see people giving big ground, but you might come to some kind of different, smaller conclusion about regulations. This is something you might want to consider if you think you're taking an unpopular position in your argument. On the other hand, it's something you might want to consider if you are not necessarily trying to convince the reader that there is a problem, but that there needs to be a different kind of solution than the ones that have been offered. If you're arguing not that everyone needs to agree with you about something universal, but that everybody, no matter what their political differences are, could agree on one small point that would make a small change to everyone's benefit, think about looking for those consensus moments. Think about looking for common ground. This is something you might be able to employ a little bit in your conclusions or as you're addressing counter arguments in your own classical argument. The last kind of argument that we're going to talk about is choir preaching. This is, and you can probably guess, you assume your audience is friendly. They already agree with you. Choir preaching does not require that much evidence. It doesn't require that much thought. It doesn't even necessarily require that much... I want to back up. It's not that it doesn't require much thought. It's just that it doesn't require much thinking about what people might object to. If you're preaching to the choir, you don't have to establish very many things because you already have the same foundations and you already have the same end goal, and you know that. In this case, you often can imagine that this is the conversation that goes on behind closed doors, where nobody's going to be fact-checking and nobody is going to be questioning your rhetorical choices. If you find yourself slipping into the first and second person as you go through your paper, if you find yourself saying we all or to us or in our society, then you might be slipping into choir preaching. And that's dangerous to do in academic arguing because you don't actually know who your audience is. You can't assume that they're going to be friendly. What you should assume is that they're going to ask for very detailed and rigorous support and evidence for everything they look at. So while you don't necessarily need to assume that your audience is hostile, you do need to assume that it's critical and that it's going to be asking you to earn every point that you make. Essentially, try to avoid choir preaching. Because, remember, you're trying to persuade, you're trying to make a change. You don't need to talk to people who already agree with you. Okay? So, this is just a summary kind of page. Think about who the audience is. Remember, you are probably making a classical argument no matter what. You may need to take in some techniques from Rogerian or hostile argument depending on what your case is and who you think you're arguing for. So think carefully about that. And when you're doing audience analysis for the class, try to look at what you think different people are doing. And as you're evaluating your sources in research, look for these kinds of things too. If you notice that the sources you're using are presuming hostility or are presuming that you will agree with them on the big things and they're not actually taking that much time or doing that much work in order to make themselves credible, you want to consider what the reasons for that are and whether they might be a credible source for you to use in the future.